starved to a skeleton in a cellar. A Lakota chief carried her out and gave her her life back. The smell reached me before I saw anything. I'd come down off the ridge following the creek, the way I always rode when the summer dried the grassland and pushed the deer toward water. My horse, a gray roan I'd had 11 years, stopped without my asking. He did that sometimes, smelled something before I caught it, and planted his feet the way he did when a man needed to think before riding forward. It was not the smell of death. I want to say that plainly. I'd known that smell since I was young enough to stand. Battles, winter camps, years when the game did not come. This was not that. It was the smell of a human being who had gone a long time without washing, and under it something else, something sour and closed and dark, the way a root cellar smells when the harvest is long eaten and the earth remembers what was stored there. There was a homestead, what was left of one. The cabin had burned not recently, the timber was black and beginning to rot at the standing ends, and the grass had grown back waist-high around the foundation stones. A barn, half collapsed, a well with a broken crank, and there at the side of what had been the yard a door set into the low earth, slanted, heavy, with a bolt on the outside. Someone had bolted it from outside. I did not rush. I sat my horse and looked at that door and thought about what I was seeing. The bolt was rusted, but the rust had a worn line across it. It had been moved, not long ago. The ground in front of the door was packed down in a place where someone had stood many times in the same spot. Not a man's boot, something smaller. I tied the roan to the barn post that was still standing, and I walked to the door and I put my hand on the bolt. Under my palm I could feel the iron heat from the afternoon sun. The bolt did not move easily. I worked it back. I don't know what I expected. I pulled the door up and the smell came out in a wave that made my eyes water, and for a moment all I could see was dark. Then my eyes adjusted and I saw the stairs going down, and at the bottom a shape that I did not immediately understand as a person. She was against the far wall. She had made herself as small as she could in the corner, her knees drawn up, her arms around her knees. Her hair was a matted tangle that covered most of her face. She wore what had been a dress. It might have been blue once, but it was so filthy and so worn through at the shoulders that it was hard to say what color it intended to be. Her feet were bare. The soles were black. She did not move when the light came in. That frightened me more than anything else. A person hears a bolt thrown and the door open and light floods in after darkness. They should flinch. They should shield their eyes or cry out or scramble away. She did nothing. She sat with her arms around her knees and her face down in the cave of her own hair, and she did not move. I came down the stairs slowly, and I crouched at the base of them and I waited. After a while she raised her head. I had thought her old from the way she sat. The way she held herself, all the tenderness gone out of the joints, the body finding its smallest configuration to preserve warmth. But she was not old. She was perhaps 30. Perhaps younger, it was hard to say because hunger does to a face what years do, but does it faster and with less patience. Her cheeks were hollowed. Her eyes were pale gray or a light blue. I couldn't be certain in that light, and they moved slowly to find my face and then stayed there. She didn't scream, she didn't run. She said very quietly, almost to herself, "I thought I had died." I said, "You have not died." Her eyes didn't change. She looked at me the way a person looks at something they're not certain is real yet, careful, measuring, not ready to believe in it. I said, "Can you walk?" She put one hand flat on the dirt floor and tried to push herself upright along the wall, and her arm went sideways and she sat back down again. She looked at her own arm for a moment like it had surprised her. Then she said, "I don't think so, not at the moment." There are things a man knows how to do that he doesn't think about until the moment he is doing them. I crossed the cellar and I crouched beside her, and I put one arm under her knees and one behind her back, and I stood. She was almost nothing. A woman 30 years old should not feel like that, should not lift like a child of 8. Her head went sideways against my shoulder, and she made a sound, not quite pain, not quite relief, something in between that had no name for it, and her hands found a grip on the front of my shirt and held on. I carried her up the stairs into the sun. She squinted hard and turned her face into my chest, and I stopped in the yard and stood there and let the sun move around us while her eyes adjusted. Her grip on my shirt did not loosen. After a while she lifted her face to the light, and I saw her expression then, not joy, not even relief in any simple way, just something unclenching, something long held finally letting go. She closed her eyes and turned her face toward the warmth like a plant that has been kept in a dark room and brought outside for the first time. I set her down on the grass near the well. Her legs would not hold, so I settled her against the well's stone ring with her back supported and her face in the sun. I worked the broken crank until I got rope enough to lower the bucket. The crank arm was sheared, but the drum still turned if you gripped it barehanded, and I brought her water. She drank too fast and her body seized and she bent forward and lost most of it. I waited. She straightened up. She drank again, this time slowly, and kept it. She said, "How long was I in there?" I said I didn't know. I asked her what she remembered last. "The fire," she said. "Someone," she stopped, started again. "Men came, 3 of them, they burned the cabin. My husband went out to meet them and they shot him." She said that part without any particular inflection, as if she were reporting something that had happened to someone else. I ran to the cellar. I thought I would be safe if I stayed quiet. Then I heard the bolt go. "They locked you in?" "Yes." "Do you know who they were?" She shook her head. "No one I'd seen before." She looked at the burned foundation for a moment. I kept count of days by the light at the crack of the door. I counted 21 days, then I stopped counting. 21 days is 3 weeks. With nothing to eat and only what moisture she could find in the root vegetables, the shriveled, forgotten ones that any cellar holds from the last harvest, 3 weeks was longer than most people would make it. I looked at her and thought about that without saying it. Her name was Clara Voss. She told me that after the second cup of water, when something behind her eyes had come back enough to remember that names were things people had. She'd come out from Ohio 3 years before, married a man named Samuel who'd filed on 160 acres along the creek. He'd built the cabin and the barn, and he'd had a plan, and she'd believed in the plan, and then men came and shot him in his own yard and bolted the door. She said all of it plainly, the way a person says a thing when they've had a long time alone to say it to themselves, and there's nothing left that will break. I brought the roan around and I looked at her legs, not injured, just wasted, and I knew she could not ride alone yet, could not hold herself in a saddle. I told her I was going to lift her up and she was going to sit in front of me and hold the horn. She nodded. She let me lift her again without protest, without thanks yet either, just a steadiness that I thought was a kind of trust, or perhaps she was simply past the point of having fear to spend. My camp was 4 miles east, below the ridge at the place where the creek bent back on itself, and there was good shade. 2 of my men were there, Chask and my cousin Achan Gleshka, who people called Spotted Owl because of the birthmark at his temple. They looked at Clara and they looked at me, and they did not ask questions right away, which is what good men do when they see something has happened, and they don't yet know the shape of it. I told Chask to make broth. Real broth, not the kind you make fast, the kind you make with bones, long and low over a small fire, the way a woman does for a sick child. He went to do it without argument. I told Achan Gleshka to go back to the homestead and look at the well and what was left of the structure, and to see if there was anything worth bringing back. She'd need clothes, or what remained of her things, if anything was left. Clara sat near the fire wrapped in a blanket, and she watched all of this. Her eyes were clearer now than they'd been in the cellar, but there was something cautious in them still, the look of a person recalibrating what was real, what could be trusted. After a while she said, "Where are we going?" I said, "Nowhere today. Today you eat and sleep." She was quiet for a moment, then she said, "And after today?" "That depends on what you want." She looked at the fire. I don't have anything. The land is mine by the filing, but there's no cabin and no equipment and no husband and no money. I have nothing. I said, you are alive. She looked at me then, really looked, the kind of looking that takes in the whole face and reads it, and something shifted in her expression. Not softness exactly, something more like recognition. Like she was seeing something she hadn't expected to be there. She said, why did you stop? At the homestead. Men passed that road. Someone passed that road in 21 days and didn't stop. My horse stopped. Your horse? He smelled you. She looked at the roan, who was picketed at the edge of the firelight, and the roan looked back at her with his ears forward. Then I owe him my life, she said. I said, you owe him a piece of sugar if you have it. She laughed. It was a small, cracked sound, a sound that had been packed away for a while and come out with dust on it, but it was real, and I felt it move through the camp the way a small warmth moves through a cold room. Achan Gleshka came back from the homestead with a trunk he'd dragged out of the ruins of the barn, half scorched on the outside, but the contents had survived, wrapped in oilcloth inside a metal box. A dress, a wool coat, a Bible with names written in the front, a small tin of sewing things, 2 letters. He set it beside her without ceremony, and she put both hands on it and sat there for a moment with her eyes closed. He's buried there, she said. Samuel. Achan Gleshka said, we can go back for that. She opened her eyes. Yes, I'd like that. We fed her broth that night, a little at a time, not enough to sicken her with it. I'd seen that before, a person starved for weeks who eats too quickly and loses what they need most. Chask tended the fire and kept the pot going, and I sat across from her and we talked, not about the men who had done this, not yet, but about where she'd come from, what Ohio was like, what her father's farm had grown. She talked the way a person talks when they've been in silence too long, and the words are stacked up behind the tongue ready to come. She slept before the fire. I covered her when the temperature dropped, and I sat where I could see her breathing, and I thought about those men. I want to explain something about what I felt, because people looking at it from the outside sometimes see only the action, the carrying, the broth, the blanket, and they call it kindness, and they're not wrong, but they're not complete either. What I felt was something harder and more certain than kindness. I had built things and lost them, and I knew what it cost. I had buried people who should have lived, and I had watched the land I knew become a place where men could ride down onto a filed claim and shoot a man in his yard and bolt his wife in a cellar and ride off unchanged. What I felt, sitting there watching her sleep, was not pity. It was a kind of responsibility that had nothing to do with law or even with what was owed. It was just the plain fact that she was here now and I was here, and the thing had been done, and what happened next was on me to decide. I'd led people my whole life. I knew what it was to be the one others looked to have the weight of decisions land on a single set of shoulders. That weight is not a burden when it fits. When the thing you can do and the thing that needs doing are the same shape, that is not burden, that is purpose. And I had been a long time without that feeling, and I had not known how much I had missed it. In the morning she could not walk well, but she was better than the day before. The broth had done something. There was color in her face that hadn't been there. She accepted my arm to stand, accepted it without making it smaller than it was, without pretending she could do it alone. There is a kind of woman who refuses help because she fears what accepting it means. Clara was not that. She accepted what was offered squarely, without gratitude that embarrassed either of us, without the kind of dependence that would make a man feel burdened. She took what was real and gave back what was real. She said, I want to go back for Samuel today, if you'll take me. We rode back to the homestead. I brought Chask and Achan Gleshka, and we dug the grave properly and moved what remained, and I said what words I knew in Lakota, and she said something in English that I think was a prayer, and we covered the mound and set a stone. She stood there for a long time with her hand on the stone, and I stood a little apart and let her have it. Then she turned to me and said, all right. Those 2 words held a lot. She was not a woman who wasted language. We broke camp 3 days later. I had been ranging northeast, following the hunting, and there was no reason I couldn't continue northeast, and the nearest town of any size was in that direction. I told her I would take her there. She said she had no money and didn't know a person in that town and didn't see what good it would do. I asked her what she would do instead. She said she didn't know yet. I said, then you'll stay with us until you do. She looked at me steadily. Then she said, I don't want charity. I said, Chask can't cook, and we need someone to look after the horses in the morning, and I'm tired of arguing with Achan Gleshka about the fire. She looked at Chask. Chask looked guilty about his cooking, which he was. She looked at the horses. She said, the gray roan has a loose shoe on his left rear. She'd seen it 3 days in camp and said nothing until now. I said, I know. She said, I can reset it. I said, I know that too. She looked at me for a long beat, and then she looked away at the plains rolling out ahead of us, and I think she was making a calculation, the kind of calculation a woman alone makes when she is deciding whether the ground beneath her feet is solid. She was not deciding whether I was kind. She'd seen that. She was deciding whether I was the kind of man who meant what he said. She said, all right, and went to get her coat from the trunk. We traveled for weeks after that. I want to be careful about how I tell this part, because it is the part people want to shape into something simple, a romance, a rescue completed, a story that closes. It was not simple, and it did not close in any one moment. It was a series of days, each one adding to the last, and in each day there were small things. The way she reset that horseshoe and did it well, quietly, without announcement. The way she learned the names of things in Lakota and used them without self-consciousness. The way she figured out Chask's cooking was not incompetence but disinterest, and how she started correcting it without making it into a lesson. Chask, who would rather take an arrow than admit he was wrong about anything, started waking up early to tend the fire before she asked. Achan Gleshka stopped arguing about wood. I noticed this. There was a night about 2 weeks after we broke camp when we were stopped at a trading post at the edge of a settlement, a rough place, 4 walls and a plank, the kind of establishment that exists to take a man's money before he gets to anywhere that has proper commerce. 2 men at the far end of the bar had been watching our party since we came in. Not all of us. Her. I was watching them watch her. She was at the other end of the bar talking to the man behind it, trying to get information about whether the town to the north had a land registry office, because she decided, I had not known this yet, she was still deciding it, that she was going to file on a new claim. She had her back to the 2 men and either didn't notice or decided not to waste attention on them. One of them pushed off from the bar and walked toward her. I moved before he got there. Not fast, not with any display, I just moved and I was between them, and the man stopped. He was younger than me by perhaps 15 years and taller by a hand, and he looked at me the way that kind of man looks when he encounters something that makes him revise his plan. I didn't say anything. He looked at me for a while, and then he went back to his end of the bar. She turned around and looked at me. I said he had the wrong idea. She said I saw. She said it without surprise, without relief even. She said it the way she'd say the weather report, a fact plainly delivered, but something in her face was not quite that simple. She looked at me the way she'd looked at me in the cellar, that first long look, reading, measuring, and this time what she found there I think she'd been looking for since the beginning, and I think she knew it when she found it. She said, thank you. I said, you don't have to thank me for that. She said, I know I don't have to. She held my gaze for a moment longer, but I wanted to. That is not how I knew. I had known for a while already, the way a man knows something he is not yet ready to say aloud. But that is the moment I stopped pretending I didn't know. She filed on the claim. 160 acres north of the settlement, along a creek that had good water year-round, and a stand of cottonwoods on the south side that would break the wind. She picked it herself. I showed her several parcels, and she walked each one and considered them the way a person considers a thing they intend to keep, and she picked the one with the cottonwoods. I told her it was a good choice. She said, "The water doesn't go shallow in August. That's the only thing that matters." I said, "That and the cottonwoods." She said, "The cottonwoods are nice, but the water doesn't go shallow." I helped her build it. Not alone. I had Chask and Achan Gleshka, and we were not moving camp for a while in any case. There was good hunting to the east, and I had decided, without making a declaration of it, that there was reason enough to stay in this ground for the fall. We raised the frame of her cabin over 3 days. She worked alongside us, not directing from the side but working, carrying beam timber and fitting joist and notching log ends until her hands bled, and she wrapped them in cloth and kept going. Chask watched her the second day and said to me, quietly in Lakota, "She will last here." I said, "I know." He said, "You are going to stay." I said I was thinking about it. He said that was the same as staying. I just hadn't told myself yet. I didn't argue with him. The question of whether I would stay was not a simple one. I was not a simple man in a simple situation. I was Lakota, and this was a time when being Lakota and living on the land meant something different with every passing season. The boundaries of what was permitted, what was safe, what was endured, narrowing in ways that no treaty seemed to slow. I had a people and a position and obligations that did not disappear because I wanted to stay in a place for a woman. I had buried men who trusted me, and I had made decisions I would carry the rest of my life, and I did not pretend that staying was simple. But there are moments when a man is honest with himself. She'd come to me one evening near the end of the building, when the walls were up and the roof was started, and we were sitting outside in the last of the light with coffee she'd made in a pot she'd gotten at the trading post. She sat beside me, not across, not at a proper distance, but beside, close enough that our shoulders nearly touched, and she looked out at the creek and the cottonwoods going gold in the evening. She said, "I've been thinking about what I owe you." I said she didn't owe me anything. She said, "I know you believe that, but I've been thinking about it anyway." She looked at the coffee in her hands. "You didn't have to stop. You could have ridden past that place 100 times without stopping. Someone did." I said I knew that. She said, "You gave me water, and you made Chask make real broth, and you buried Samuel, and you didn't make me feel small for needing help, and you didn't ask for anything." She paused. "Most men ask for something." I said, "I'm not most men." She looked at me then sideways direct, that way she had, and she said, "No, you are not." She reached over and she put her hand on my arm, not soft, not the kind of touch that asks permission, the kind that states something. She said, "I want you to stay." I looked at her hand on my arm. I looked at her face in the evening light, the color come back into it now, the eyes clear and reading me the way they'd been reading me since the beginning, from that moment in the cellar floor when she decided to believe I was real. I said, "I know." She said, "Is that yes?" I said, "It's the same as yes." She looked back at the creek. Her hand stayed where it was. After a while she said, "Chask told me that was the same as yes." I said, "You've been talking to Chask." She said, "He's a better cook than he lets on." I said, "He's going to be insufferable about this." She laughed, that real laugh now, not the cracked one from the first day, the full one that she'd gotten back along with everything else, and the sound of it went out across the water and the cottonwoods, and the evening closed around us, and that was enough. That was all of it. A man who'd ridden a long time alone, and a woman who'd survived what she shouldn't have survived, sitting in the last of the light on the land she'd filed for and intended to keep. The cabin was done before the first snow. I know every log of it. I set the hearthstone myself, brought it from the creek, a flat gray piece of limestone the size of a plow blade, and I set it level by hand. When the fire burns in that hearth, the stone glows warm at the edges in a way that no other stone would do, because no other stone came from that particular bend of creek, and no other man brought it. The winter was hard. That country's winters are not apologetic. They come down out of the north like a judgment, and they don't lift for months. But the cabin held. The walls we'd notched were tight, and the roof shed snow, and the hearthstone did what I'd chosen it to do. On the worst nights, when the wind came around the corner of the building and tested the seams, she would sit close to me the way she'd sat that evening with the coffee, her shoulder against mine, and she would say nothing because nothing needed saying. The wind came and the fire held and the stone glowed, and that was the whole world for those hours, and I was the steady center of it, and she had chosen it, and she stayed. There is a thing that happens to a man who has been a long time doing hard things with no one to witness them. The work still gets done. A man like me does not stop because no one is watching, but something in it is different when someone sees. Not the watching that measures and judges, the watching that knows. That has seen the worst of a season and the best, and holds both without needing to say which was which. She saw me that way. She'd seen me since that first day in the cellar, from the moment she raised her head and found my face. In the spring the creek flooded a little, not dangerously, but enough to soften the ground at the south end of the property and threaten the fence she'd put in. I went out in the cold mud before she woke and shored up the posts, and when she came out in the morning with her boots in her hand and saw what had been done, she stopped and looked at me and didn't say anything for a moment. Then she said, "You were up before light." I said there'd been some fence to see to. She sat down on the step and put her boots on, and she looked at the fence, and the posts I'd set, and the tamped mud around the bases, and she looked at me. She said, "Come eat breakfast." I said I would. She stood up and put her hand on the side of my face, just her palm, flat and warm, against my jaw, and she held it there for one moment, looking at me the way she always looked, reading and finding what she expected to find. Then she went inside to make the fire. And I stood there in the spring mud with the creek running and the cottonwoods coming green, and I thought, this is what it is. Not the dramatic moment, not the story a man tells to make it into something clean and finished. Just this: the ground underfoot, the smell of good earth, the window with the light in it. The woman who looked at me and saw what I was, and put her hand on my face and said, "Come eat." A man can spend his whole life being useful and capable and never have that. The right pair of eyes looking at the right time and saying plainly, "I see you. You are worth this. You are the reason I stayed." I went inside.